George, Margaret, Emily, and little Noah Parker, a family so ordinary they could have lived next door to anyone. But on a cold October morning in Derby, their quiet red brick home was reduced to ashes, and what investigators found inside was so horrific it would haunt them for years. What began as a house fire soon revealed something far darker. One man's obsession, a web of buried grudges, and a truth so devastating that it made even the toughest detectives cry. In the small English town of Derby, the Parker family lived in a red brick house on Meadow Ridge Lane. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where people still waved to one another from their driveways and left their front doors unlocked during the day. Children rode bicycles along the pavement, and the sound of lawnmowers hummed softly on weekends. George Parker, a retired firefighter, was well known in the community for his bravery and calm demeanor. His wife, Margaret, spent most of her days tending to her rose garden and baking for local charity events. Their daughter, Emily, had recently moved back in after a difficult divorce, bringing along her 6-year-old son, Noah, a cheerful boy who loved drawing fire engines and playing football in the back garden. To anyone looking in from the outside, the Parkers appeared to be the picture of normalcy, a family grounded in routine, tradition, and quiet love. But on the morning of October 14, 2017, the illusion of safety on Meadow Ridge Lane was shattered. At 6:42 a.m., a jogger named Paul Jenkins noticed a thin column of smoke rising into the pale autumn sky. At first he thought someone was burning leaves, but as he drew closer, the smell changed, thick, chemical, and wrong. By the time he reached the Parker house, flames were spilling out of the living room window, licking up the brick walls like orange ribbons. He called emergency services, his voice shaking as he gave the address. Within minutes, fire engines filled the street. Neighbors gathered outside in their dressing gowns, watching helplessly as firefighters battled the blaze. The air was heavy with smoke and confusion. Someone said they'd seen Margaret the evening before, smiling and watering her roses. Someone else swore they'd heard shouting around midnight, though no one could be sure. When the flames finally died down, what remained of the Parker home was a blackened skeleton of wood and stone. Inside, investigators found what no one wanted to believe. 3 bodies were discovered in the ruins. They were quickly identified as George, Margaret, and Emily. Each showed signs of violence, injuries that couldn't have come from the fire itself. Noah was missing at first, and for a brief, desperate moment, police hoped he had escaped. But when the kitchen was cleared, they found him in a corner near the back door, his small form still clutching a blanket. He had died from smoke inhalation before he could get out. The discovery broke even the most experienced firefighters, some of whom had worked alongside George for years. Detectives arriving on scene were struck by the unnatural quiet that followed. The smell of burnt fabric lingered in the air, mixing with the cold October wind. There were no signs of forced entry, but drawers had been pulled open and several items were missing. It looked like an attempted cover-up, a crime buried beneath fire. When investigators examined the burn patterns, they realized the blaze had started in multiple places at once. It wasn't an accident. Someone had wanted to make sure nothing survived. Not the evidence, not the truth, not even the memories of those who once lived there. And somewhere in Derby, that person was still out there, watching as the smoke of their crime drifted into the morning sky. Investigators worked through the ruins of the Parker house with painstaking care. Every step crunched on shards of glass and blackened debris. The air inside still carried a faint, acrid sting from the fire. What was once a family home now looked like the inside of a furnace. Beneath the charred beams and melted picture frames, detectives searched for anything that could tell them what had happened that night. They photographed every corner, bagged fragments of burnt fabric, and sifted through piles of ash with gloved hands. It didn't take long to confirm that the fire hadn't started naturally. The burn patterns on the walls and floors showed clear evidence of multiple ignition points. Someone had walked through the house, setting it alight from room to room. When the results from the autopsies arrived, they painted an even darker picture. George and Margaret had both suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head. The blows were consistent with a heavy object, possibly a crowbar or a metal pipe. Emily's injuries were different. Defensive wounds on her hands and forearms indicated she had fought back. Her struggle had been desperate, but brief. Noah, only 6 years old, had no visible injuries. He had died from smoke inhalation, most likely hiding from the chaos. The thought of it weighed heavily on the entire investigative team. Even seasoned detectives admitted later that it was one of the hardest cases they had ever seen. The fire, they realized, had been an attempt to destroy evidence, but the killer had made mistakes. In the remains of the living room, crime scene technicians found traces of a chemical accelerant not normally found in household fires. It was a blend used in certain industrial cleaning products, rare, expensive, and easily traceable. That detail became the team's first real lead. They began contacting local businesses that used or sold such chemicals, hoping it would point them in a direction. Meanwhile, another group of officers collected surveillance footage from the area. Most of the street cameras had poor visibility due to fog that night, but one private camera, mounted outside a small grocery shop 2 blocks away, caught something useful. At 11:46 p.m., a white van drove slowly past, headlights off. It paused briefly near Meadow Ridge Lane, just long enough for its registration plate to catch a faint reflection in the light. The footage was grainy and distorted by the smoke from the fire, but digital enhancement revealed enough characters from the plate to run through the national database. The number traced back to a man named Lewis Granger. Granger was a familiar name to one of the detectives. Years earlier, he had worked with George Parker at the fire department before leaving under strained circumstances. His record showed disciplinary action for misconduct and a theft allegation that had forced his resignation. No one had ever proved the accusations, but rumors had followed him. Investigators learned that after losing his job, Granger had opened a small mechanical repair business on the outskirts of Derby, one that used the same industrial chemicals found in the Parker home. The coincidence was too strong to ignore. Detectives obtained a warrant and visited his workshop the next morning. The building was old and cluttered, filled with tools, oil stains, and stacks of metal drums. Among them were several containers labeled with the same accelerant compound. It was clear they had found the source. Still, they needed more than chemicals and suspicion. They needed a link between Granger and that night. What no one could explain yet was why a man who once worked beside George Parker, a man who knew him well, would commit such an act of brutality. The ashes had given up clues, but not the reason. And in that gap of uncertainty, the mystery only grew darker. Lewis Granger's name carried a certain weight within the old Derby firehouse. Those who had served with him remembered a man with skill but a short temper, someone who could switch from laughter to fury without warning. Years earlier, when a series of expensive tools went missing from the fire department's storage unit, suspicion had quietly turned toward him. The official report never named a culprit, but soon after, Granger resigned. He claimed he was leaving for personal reasons, but rumors spread fast. Many believed George Parker, known for his honesty and strictness, had been the one to report him. Though no one could prove it, the two men had not spoken since. While George retired with honor, Granger drifted from job to job until he eventually opened a small repair workshop on the edge of town, a place that smelled constantly of oil, rust, and chemical solvents. When detectives first approached him about the Parker murders, Granger didn't seem surprised. His workshop was dimly lit, cluttered with half-repaired machinery and greasy rags. On a metal shelf sat rows of industrial cleaning agents, including the very chemical found at the Parker home. When asked about them, he said they were used for engine degreasing and maintenance work. His answers came too smoothly, as if rehearsed in advance. He maintained polite eye contact, but never asked any questions of his own. The calmness in his voice unsettled the officers. There was no trace of shock or sorrow upon hearing that an entire family had died. The forensic team collected samples from his shop, but none could directly tie him to the crime scene. Without that link, police had to let him go. He locked up his workshop, nodded to the officers, and walked away as if the matter were trivial. Still, investigators couldn't shake the sense that he was playing a quiet game with them, waiting watching, maybe even enjoying their frustration. They decided to dig deeper into his background, hoping to uncover anything that might explain his connection to the Parkers. Days passed without progress. Then a new piece of evidence surfaced by chance. A neighbor living 2 doors down from the Parker house came forward with security footage from a camera that overlooked the narrow alley behind the property. The camera had been positioned awkwardly, capturing only partial views of people passing through. Yet, on the night of October 13th, at around 11:30 p.m., it caught a shadowy figure walking toward the Parkers' back gate. The person was holding what appeared to be a fuel can. Despite the darkness, the man's build, walk, and face, briefly illuminated by a passing car's headlights, matched Louis Granger. The moment the footage was reviewed, detectives knew it was the missing link they needed. They brought Granger in again, this time with the video playing silently in front of him. At first, he stared blankly at the screen. His fingers tapped the metal table. Then, without warning, his composure began to crumble. He rubbed his hands over his face and muttered something under his breath. Finally, he admitted he had been there that night. The room fell still as he began to describe, in halting words, why he went to the Parkers' house. But what came next didn't fit the detective's expectations. He claimed he hadn't gone there to kill anyone, that Emily Parker had called him, asking for his help with something secret, something to do with her father. It was a story that twisted the case in a direction no one had imagined, and it left everyone in the room wondering whether Granger was confessing to murder or crafting one last calculated lie. Louis Granger's confession came in fragments, spilling out slowly as if he were trying to convince himself it was true. He sat hunched over the table, his hands trembling while detectives recorded every word. He admitted being inside the Parker home on the night of the fire, yet he clung to his claim that he wasn't a murderer. According to him, Emily Parker had contacted him days earlier, asking him to meet her in secret. She had allegedly discovered something about her father, a hidden stash of money George had supposedly stolen from a departmental fund before retiring. Granger said she wanted help confronting him about it. He insisted his visit wasn't about revenge, but about helping her get what she believed was hers. As he told it, things had spiraled out of control. When he arrived at the house, everyone was awake. Emily had already confronted George, and an argument had erupted in the living room. Granger described shouting, accusations, and Margaret trying to calm them down. Then, according to him, George became violent. Granger claimed that George lunged at him, and in panic he grabbed the nearest object, a metal bar from beside the fireplace, and struck back. He said the blow was instinctive, not deliberate. Margaret screamed. Emily tried to pull him away, and then everything went blank. When he came to, the room was quiet. The bodies of the Parkers lay motionless, and the house smelled of smoke and gasoline. Granger said he didn't know what else to do. Fearing no one would believe him, he set the fire to make it look like an accident and fled. Detectives listened carefully but found the story full of gaps. There was no record of a phone call or message between Emily and Granger. Forensic specialists searched the house for any evidence of stolen cash or hidden compartments, but found nothing. George Parker's financial records were spotless. He had never handled department funds during his career and had no unexplained income. Every part of Granger's confession seemed designed to shift blame away from himself. Still, something about his manner troubled the investigators. His emotion flickered between regret and anger, as though he was mourning the situation more than the victims. When asked why he didn't go to the police after the fire, he said no one would have believed him, that everyone already saw him as the disgraced ex-firefighter. He admitted he had hated George for years, but insisted he didn't go there to kill him. To the detectives, it was clear he had woven truth and lies together, until even he couldn't separate them anymore. The police presented the evidence to the prosecution, confident they had enough for a conviction. Yet beneath the relief, there was a strange unease. Something didn't add up. The timeline, the supposed blackout, the missing motive, all of it left questions no one could answer. Then, just when the case seemed closed, A technician working through the last pieces of recovered data from the fire discovered something unexpected. Hidden among the melted debris of Noah's bedroom was a small, half-destroyed device with a faint blinking light, a wireless baby monitor that had survived against all odds. When detectives learned that it might have recorded part of that night, they realized the investigation was far from over. What that recording contained would not only prove Granger's lies, but would also leave even the hardest officers shaken to their core. 2 months after the Parker family murders, when the case had settled into the slow rhythm of paperwork and trial preparation, a cleanup crew returned to the ruins of the house on Meadow Ridge Lane. They were tasked with clearing the last remains of debris before the property was officially condemned. While sifting through the ash and splintered furniture in what used to be Noah's bedroom, one of the workers noticed a small, melted piece of plastic wedged beneath the warped frame of a bed. It was barely recognizable at first, covered in soot and fused to a tangle of wires, but a closer look revealed a familiar logo, part of a baby monitor. The device's battery was long dead, but its model was one that automatically backed up recordings to a cloud server. The discovery was immediately passed on to detectives, who hoped it might contain something, anything, that could shed new light on what had really happened that night. Technicians worked for days to recover the data. Most of the files were corrupted, but a few fragments survived. The recovered audio began at 11:38 p.m., roughly 20 minutes before the fire was reported. It was faint at first, muffled by distance, but soon distinct voices could be heard. George and Margaret were asleep. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the hall. Emily's voice appeared next, startled but steady, demanding to know who was there. The reply was harsh, a man's tone thick with anger. Lewis Granger. The words were broken by static, but what followed needed no translation: shouting, the crash of furniture, and Emily's desperate pleas for her son. The audio grew chaotic. There were thuds, a sharp crack like metal against wood, and the sound of something heavy falling. Margaret's voice cried out once, then silence. A few seconds later, the unmistakable roar of flames burst through the speaker, the accelerant igniting, swallowing the room. The investigators who listened to it described a moment of complete horror as they realized what they were hearing. There was no mention of hidden money, no confrontation about a secret fund. Granger's earlier confession had been nothing more than an attempt to disguise his hatred. He had broken into the Parker home out of pure bitterness, believing George was responsible for the end of his career. The killings were not an accident or a moment of panic. They were deliberate acts of vengeance. As the final seconds of the recording played, the chaos faded into the soft crackle of fire consuming the house. Then, through the hiss of smoke, a small voice emerged. Noah's. He was calling for his mother, coughing, his words barely audible. It was the sound that broke the detectives who had spent months chasing the truth. Hardened officers who had seen countless scenes of tragedy found themselves wiping tears from their faces as they listened. The entire room fell silent when the playback ended. When the evidence was presented in court, Granger's fabricated story collapsed instantly. The jury needed only 1 day to reach a unanimous verdict. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Parker house was demolished soon after, leaving nothing but an empty patch of grass where laughter, love, and light had once filled the air. For the people of Derby, the vacant lot became more than a crime scene. It was a wound that never truly healed, a place where the memory of one family's final night whispered softly through the wind.